Well, this morning in our gospel lesson for today, sort of to set the scene, we find Jesus in a place called the Mount of Olives. And actually, if you look close at this picture, it's not far from Jerusalem, where he would find himself in just a short time. A bit later on this night, when he was at the Mount of Olives, we find Jesus going to a garden called Gethsemane, which is actually on the Mount of Olives. And it's in that garden where Peter denies him and Judas betrays him. And you know the rest of the story. He goes to the cross and suffers and dies and rises from the dead. But in the midst of all this, and especially in what we've been talking about in the last few weeks through the Gospel of Matthew, we see Jesus going through, I've seen it titled as the Great Shift, the Great Transition. And he's taking his disciples from this period of time where he's trying to build their trust and trying to build a relationship with them. And then he shifts to getting at what it truly means to be a disciple of Jesus. He starts with calling the 12 disciples, telling them that I want you to fish for people. And most of them had fishing in their minds, so they're kind of getting that. And they follow Jesus. And then all of a sudden, Jesus starts doing these miracles. And we've talked about these in the last few weeks of turning bread into wine, or turning water into wine, and then taking a little fish and a little bread and turning that into feeding 5,000 people. And there were many other miracles that Jesus did. So he's building that trust within them. And then all of a sudden we see people coming just by the thousands to be healed by Jesus. And I can just see the looks on the faces of the disciples in amazement, like, really? That man who hasn't walked in years is walking? That person who's been blind, that person who was dead is now back to life? And so we have the healing and we have the miracles, and sometimes we forget about the teaching part, where the disciples a number of times said, this is just amazing. And the crowds were following in the masses. And there was a number of occasions where there were so many people that were following Jesus that he couldn't even be seen, and he had to get into a boat and go out onto the water a distance away to teach the disciples. But then we start to see this shift. As the disciples are in this sort of thrilled moment, Jesus takes them up on a mountain and says, blessed are the poor, and blessed are the peacemakers, and blessed are those who are poor in spirit. And they're starting to think a little different. And then Jesus said to them, you are the salt of the earth. And he was telling them that you can make a difference. And this shift just keeps going. And then while he's up on the mountain, he explains to them in this radical form what the commandments are all about. And it's totally different than what they'd been taught years ago. And then Jesus starts to model to them time and time again praying, and how important it is to pray as a disciple. And then Jesus said something like, if someone hits you on one cheek, turn and let them hit you on the other cheek. And the disciples are like, really? Don't serve two masters. And in the midst of this, Jesus tells them at least 25 parables, short stories with a lesson about the kingdom. And some of them they understood and some of them they didn't. But he's getting at what it means to be a disciple in the kingdom of God. But do you see the shift from this trust and building the base to becoming a true disciple? St. Luke was very clear. If you read through his gospel a number of times, in the midst of this shift, St. Luke says, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. Or Jesus is directing their minds towards Jerusalem. So as Jesus this morning is on the Mount of Olives, this is the last opportunity he has with his disciples before he's arrested and the trial and the suffering and the cross. And Jesus makes good use of his time this morning with the story of the 10 bridesmaids. 5 were foolish and 5 were wise. Now, wedding customs today are entirely different than 2,000 years ago during Jesus' time. When we think of coming into weddings, there's all this beauty, especially up here at the altar. And there's flowers, and there's tuxedos, and there's wedding dresses. But it was different during Jesus' time. And it was different, first of all, because the father of the groom made the arrangements for the groom's wife. The father of the groom would choose the wife and then tell his son who he's going to marry. And there were times that the groom's father and the bride's father would come together beforehand, and they would be in conversation, and they would agree on their children's marriage. I went to college with a classmate of mine. His name was Isaac Rampersad, and he was from India. He was born in India but raised in the United States, and his father was a professor at Defiance College. Well, in the summer before Isaac's senior year, his father went to India to choose his wife and to bring her back to marry Isaac. And believe it or not, I got to meet her before Isaac did, because we had this party at our fraternity house, and we're all waiting inside with Isaac for her to come, and I just so happened to go out in the parking lot, and his father came up with her and introduced her to me, and then went inside, and they've been married ever since. So the father made the arrangements, and then the couple would spend some time together, and they would make a covenant, an agreement. They would write their vows, as we call it today. And would often be a period of time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months. And when they finally agreed on this covenant, they would take it back to his father and let him know they agreed on the promises, and then the celebration would begin, which is where our story picks up for today. The 10 bridesmaids, or the 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. And it takes place at the wedding party. And these bridesmaids, they are at the reception to meet the groom. It hadn't started yet, because it doesn't start until the groom comes, and then the father of the bride brings her a little bit later. And again, just remember, these bridesmaids had waited for days, if not longer, for the arrival. They weren't sure when the party would start. But here's 2 keys to the story. The bridesmaids were already worthy enough to be invited to the reception, to the wedding. But they had lamps, because their main responsibility as bridesmaids was to light up the reception hall during the celebration. It's an important part of this story. They had to wait longer than they expected. Who knows how long? But 5 of them, as the story goes, the foolish ones, they ran out of oil. The 5 wise, they had plenty of oil. they had extra on hand. They were prepared, as our children obviously are teaching us. And the 5 foolish, they had to go out and buy more wine in order to fulfill their responsibility of lighting up the reception hall. Here comes the tragedy of the story. While they were gone, the bridegroom returns along with the bride, and the wedding feast began, and the doors were locked, not allowing the 5 foolish bridesmaids to return back in. And then, after Jesus told this parable, he ended with these words: "Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know neither the day nor the hour when Jesus will return." And they're actually similar words that he would say a little bit later that night to his disciples when he would go up into the Garden of Gethsemane and Jesus would go off to pray, and he told the disciples, just wait here and watch. And they end up falling asleep. So there's a couple of things about this story. One is that keeps going through my mind is, why didn't the 5 bridesmaids share their oil with the 5 foolish? And obviously the story says, well, we won't have enough, but that's always been a question that sort of gets at me. Why didn't they share? But here's the second part. These lamps, or these candles, and actually to describe this a little further, in that big opening is where you pour the oil, and there's a little wick that goes through it, and the light would shine on the right-hand side of that. But these lamps or candles are a huge part of the story. The job of the bridesmaids was to light up the reception. They were invited and worthy, but their responsibility was to light up the hall. So 2 illustrations I want to lift up this morning. One is, I grew up on Lake Erie. I spent a lot of time on boats and out on the water. And on occasion, I remember hearing the term lamp trimmer. That was an old term. But there were people years ago who were specialists on lake freighters when there was no electricity. And their job was to maintain and to care for the oil lamps on the ship so that there was light. They had to first of all monitor the lamps so that wherever they're sitting, if they got spilled over or dumped or turned in a different way because of the rough sea, they didn't want the oil to spill out with the light and burn down the boat. But their job was also to fill the lamps with oil. And then the last was to trim the lamps with the wick. They had to trim it in such a way that it would burn evenly to keep light and to save oil. If the wicks were too long, and actually John and I talked about, should we light the candles this morning, should we not? We do that in the praise service, or we do it in the traditional service, we don't do it in the praise, but I have a hunch. As you look back here, you can see there's some candles that are burning with a long wick. Those candles, the oil will burn up quickly. And then there's one, you can see on the right, which needs to bring the wick up a little bit to burn a little brighter. If the wicks are too long, burn up the oil too quickly. If they're too short, there's not enough light. These lamp trimmers were very important crew members on a ship. So that's one illustration. The second illustration is our own candles. And believe it or not, we've been discussing this quite a bit lately about should we use these candles, should we not? In all honesty, they are a mess to try to fill. So I kind of brought one of the smaller candles, and I got to put on my white gloves, right? So I don't stain the gold in the candle. And what happens is, you take the top off, like this, and there's a wick underneath, and you have to make sure the wick's long enough, and then you have to take oil and dump it in the candles, and usually they spill down the side of the candle, and you see there's a little base here that holds the remainder of the wick, or the remainder of the spilled over oil. And actually this week when I went to look at this and to kind of know I was going to use this as an experiment, I realized we'd actually run out of oil. We ran out of oil. And again, this is messy. To try to fill these candles the way that they should be filled. And it takes a lot of work to get those wicks exactly where they're supposed to be, to burn evenly for one thing. If it's too long, the oil burns up too quickly. If it's too short, they don't give off enough light, but it's a messy and a difficult job. Ask our altar guild. But do you see what Jesus is saying in the parable? We are invited to the banquet. We are worthy enough for God to invite us to His banquet, to His wedding feast. But we are the lamps, or the candles, if you will. And we have a responsibility for Jesus to shine in our lives. And if we don't constantly fill our lives with oil, with His Word, and with grace, and with worship, and with prayer, and with service, we either become empty or burn out. Is anybody feeling burnout today? Or empty? Well, know that it's very hard work. And it's often messy. And even at times stressful to prepare to fill our lamps. There's things often in our lives that we put off. And sometimes we put off filling our lamps with oil when our responsibility is to shine. There's things that we're so tempted to put off in our lives. I've talked to 3 people in the last week or 2 weeks that either didn't have renter's insurance or homeowner's insurance, and something drastically happened. And in all 3 of the conversations, they said, we should have done that before. Or if you're a young parent, you can't put off buying diapers and baby wipes. You've got to be prepared. Or if you're a student in school, whether high school or college, and exams, putting off preparing for exams is not good. Or maybe it's in your marriage. You've been putting off some things that need to be struggled with. Or maybe you're in a conflict with someone and you say, I'll talk to him later. And you put that off. And Jesus actually gives us the hard word for the day and says, that's foolish. Remember the story of Mary and Martha? Where Mary was so stressed and burnt out. And Jesus said, you haven't chosen the most important thing. You need to fill yourself with my relationship with you. Jesus said that at all times we have to be prepared, for no one knows the hour. There's a 90% chance of tomorrow. We hear from our weather reports that that's 50% chance of rain or 70% chance of snow, but there's about a 90% chance of tomorrow. But in that 10%, are you willing to take that risk? Are there people in your lives that you love and appreciate that you're putting off telling them that to? Thank you, I love you, forgive me. Is there anything in your life which you would be embarrassed or ashamed about if Jesus would come back? Are you prepared? Do you have enough oil for your lamp? Who knows what kind of severe test you're going to face, like having to go somewhere and do something out of the control and the norm of your life. But who knows what doors might be opened? Are you prepared?